If painting clouds are a bit mysterious for you, welcome to this video where I will teach you how to unlock the secrets of painting clouds in soft pastel. You will learn a simple technique for laying an effective foundation for painterly and impressionistic clouds. I'll also teach you my trick for magical beginnings. I love to use this technique, and it really does help to create the luminosity and the wispiness of clouds. I'll also share with you my mark-making secrets to keep your clouds very light and free. I'm excited to have you here with me today in Monet Cafe Studio. Grab yourself a cup of coffee and let's get started. Let's talk about the supplies for this lesson, and as I always say, feel free to improvise and use what you have. I'll be using a sheet of Luxe Archival pastel paper. I love this surface. It is water friendly, as you will see, and it really holds up to a lot of pastel layering. Of course, you will need some soft pastels. My palette was actually quite small, even less than what you see here. I'll be talking about that as I paint. To create the magical soft beginning, I'm using drugstore alcohol. And if you want to use this technique, make sure you're using a water-friendly surface. Of course, you'll need a paintbrush. These are the brushes that I love. You can use whatever you have, though. And that's really pretty much it. It's not a lot of supplies, and we're going to have a lot of fun. I'll have links for all of these supplies in the About section of this video. Now, let me share with you the beautiful reference image that I used for inspiration. If you've watched many of my tutorials, you probably know I love the site unsplash.com for copyright-free reference images, and this is an album that I curated on that site for my patrons on my Patreon page to be able to access this month. It is Cloud Painting Month on my Patreon page, and I chose a beautiful reference image from photographer Rachel Sanner. Thank you so much, Rachel, and I'll have a link to this image in the description of this video. I cropped this image for my composition, and once again, if you're a patron of mine on my Patreon page, you will get this cropped version as well. I thought I'd first show you a quick little speed demo of my little sketch. I'm just using a sketchbook and this Faber-Castell pastel pencil, and all I'm doing is trying to tweak this composition a bit. You can see in the reference image, now I loved it as is, it's beautiful, but you can see that the clouds are running in a horizontal band across the sky, and I really wanted to create some drama here. You can ignore my little sketching here. I was initially going to include this little building and even some of the little cows, but you'll see later I decide just to keep it simple and just have the tree, the road, and the field. But like I said, I want to create some movement, drama, and perspective with these clouds. So rather than painting them just horizontally, I'm going to bring them up and out perspectively. This is going to give that real sense of depth to the scene and just a bit more drama to the clouds. And I find it's always advantageous to do a little sketch before getting started. Here I'm just showing my board. This is a board that I made. I actually have a video on how I made it here on my YouTube channel. I think it's called DIY Artboard. And here I'm just showing the Luxe Archival package. This is an 11 by 14 pack. I love this surface. Now we're going to jump right into painting, but I wanted to share that I have some special content over on my Patreon page. I gave a behind the scenes of how I actually pick out my color palette, and I go through kind of my thought process and a lot about color theory, and also share more about the particular pastels I chose. I also often include my color notes on my Patreon version of these tutorials. But there's plenty of content here to learn from and hundreds of videos here on the Monet Cafe channel. So I'm just marking down a lot of these colors. I certainly don't use all of these. I ended up using a fairly limited palette, actually. And I use this Jack Richardson set. It's called the Landscape Set, to choose some colors for a brilliant underpainting. I wanted to add some beautiful pinks beneath these clouds. So I've circled those colors that I use, and even though you can't see the color numbers, I think you could figure it out if you have this set. The surface of my Luxe Archival is 11 by 14, or the way I have it, 14 by 11. And if you ever want to create a final painting that's the same proportions as your reference image, remember I cropped my reference image, you can do this simple little trick. You tape it up to the corner of your surface and you make a diagonal across the actual reference image. And wherever it lands on your painting surface, that's going to be where the bottom gets cut off, basically. I'm just measuring to see where that mark was. It was a little less than 8 inches. So I make another mark, and I'm not going to cut it. I'm just going to put a piece of tape across the bottom. And now my image or my surface is going to be proportionately the same as my reference image. And now to recreate the sketch, I'm using the same pastel pencil, just getting a lower third horizon line because this is about the sky, and my upper part of the painting, the upper 2/3 or more actually, is going to be the clouds and the sky. And so I'm speeding this up because it's really the same kind of little sketch. It's very basic. I have this little road coming in at the bottom right-hand side, and this is not normally a placement that I would do in a composition. Normally we don't put something just right at the edge of a painting like this, but I don't know why I was fascinated by this. It was that way in the reference image. It felt like you had this little road curving around to the right, and then I imagined it making a curve in the distance to the left, kind of like it was going to that house that I ended up not including. But here is where I am trying to recreate my clouds. Like I mentioned, I'm not going to make them horizontally across like similar to the horizon line. I felt like that was just kind of boring. So I am just creating these cloud shapes perspectively. It's going to work very similar to like that 1-point perspective you learn in school where you make the road and you bring it from the point out wide. Well, the same thing kind of happens with clouds in the upper horizon. I did go ahead and sketch in the little house, and I was like, I made it too big at first, and then I made it smaller. And later I was like, I feel like this is TMI, too much information. So I ended up losing those little structures and the cows. And now it's time to create this underpainting, which I believe is a key foundation for the rest of this painting. And I think you're going to enjoy the process and find that it's actually not all that hard. You might be wondering, why did you choose these colors? They weren't in your original palette. But I mentioned in my Patreon portion of this that I wanted to give this a little color punch. And again, I'm using 4 colors from the Jack Richardson landscape set that I shared the picture of it before with those colors actually circled. And again, all links to the products are in the description of this video. Now this is sped up a little bit here on the Monet Cafe version, but I'm going to talk you through it. Notice that I put this pretty lavender color in the sky portion, kind of at the top, and the lighter values I put on like where the billowy clouds are. And the way clouds work is they are a 3-dimensional object, even though we think of them as very wispy. So I'm literally painting the shadows just like I would an object. We've got our sun coming up from the upper right, casting down onto the tops of these clouds. And underneath these clouds, it's going to be a little more in shadow. That's why I'm using this brilliant pink. It'll all make sense in just a minute. First, let me ask you real quickly, if you're liking this video so far, please hit that like button. It really helps. Leave a comment. I love to hear from you. And subscribe if you haven't already, and get hundreds of videos here on my channel. Also, if you'd like all the extra content I'm always talking about, consider becoming a patron on my Patreon page. But there's lots of content here, so let's get back to it. So as I was saying, I'm just using value in a way to create objects that feel 3-dimensional. Again, clouds actually do have some mass to them. Have you ever done like the sphere in school where you leave part of it light and then part of it's in shadow, the gradation in between? And that's really kind of the same concept with clouds. You're going to see me do some blending soon. So you see I added that darkest magenta to represent the trees. Vertical elements are almost always the darkest in a scene. And more of these other 2 colors to block in the foreground, the little taller grasses, and the distant field with that light lavender. And this is going to really come to life when I start to add this alcohol. Yes, it's just regular drugstore alcohol. I like to use 70%, and you could use water it just dries a little slower. I really like the alcohol. These are brushes that I love to use. The one that I used is the larger one, the 16 round 4050R, made by Princeton Art and Brush Company. Again, all links will be in the description of this video. I just put a decent amount of this alcohol in the jar because I've learned if I have enough alcohol in my jar, I don't have to rinse my brush off and I can just keep painting. I like to keep some paper towels just to control the amount of alcohol on my brush, and this is where it really gets fun. Before I add the alcohol, I want to give a quick shout out to those who have purchased my new book, Artistic Inspirations. It is a combination of two things I love, art and scripture. It's available on Amazon. It's quite affordable, and I want to thank those of you who have given me such great product review descriptions. I'm very grateful. This was a labor of love, and I pray it blesses you. I have the link up here in the corner if you want to purchase it, and in the description of this video. All right, now for the fun and what I think is a wonderful way to paint clouds by liquefying these pastels using alcohol. It's one of my favorite techniques for doing an underpainting, and I think you're going to see why. So now it looks rather segmented and kind of chunky, but watch what happens when I add this alcohol. These brushes work really well. I realized I didn't have quite enough alcohol on my brush, and that's something that it takes some time and some practice and some finesse, but once you get the hang of it, it is so much fun. And I also recommend to make your strokes in the direction of the clouds. I think of it as if I'm caressing the clouds. Like if I could roll my hand over the clouds and form the shape, that's how you want to move your brush and move these pastels around. And basically what we're doing here is we are liquefying the pastels, turning them into paint. Yes, pastels are paint like any other medium. They are just not in the wet form. They're in a dry form. So we're just turning them into paint. And it works so well. So now you can see what I was describing before, how clouds are like a three-dimensional object. I have in certain areas, it starts to make sense more as I paint, but in the billowy cloud portions, it has light that's on the top of those clouds. That's where the sun is coming from. It's up high, and it gradually gets darker underneath the clouds. Now, the reference photo I used had the clouds as very dark, like a stormy day or evening, and I decided to make mine more of a day scene, so I didn't include those dark values. So as you can see, I'm moving my brush now in the direction of the land. Land flattens out in the distance and becomes kind of like a blanket. And in the foreground, typically you have taller grasses. You'll see me make my brush strokes there. But now you can see I'm just working on these clouds, kind of blending those values again to create that three-dimensional feel. And the other thing too is these pastels, once you wet them, they move around a bit. So you can literally leave some of that paint on your brush and make a mark or a paint stroke somewhere else with it. You'll see me do that with the road in just a minute. So here I'm making vertical, kind of tall marks to represent some grasses. And in my sketch, you may have remembered, I made my directional strokes in a way that I thought complemented this composition, almost pointing to those clouds, bringing the viewer into that field. And now's where I just have a little bit of that pastel or wet pastel still on my brush, and I just used it to get a little bit of color on that road. Now, can you see, now that it's dry, where kind of some of my cloud formations are? And now it's time to add some pastels. I ended up with a very limited palette. I didn't use all the pastels I had in my tray there. And again, if you're a patron of mine, I give you my color notes. It's a graphic that I have showing the colors I used. Now this is, it looks like it's black, right? This is a Terry Ludwig eggplant color. It's really a dark purple. And I need to reinforce my darkest elements here. And the darkest elements are typically, like I said, in a landscape, they're vertical elements and also elements that are closer to the viewer. Now that tree looks like a blob right now, but it's okay. I'm going to carve in negatively later to represent some of the spaces in between those branches. So here I'm still using, actually this is kind of a dark magenta I switched to, really dark. And like I said, things in the foreground are darker typically, but as they recede into the distance, they get lighter in value. It's called aerial perspective. Literally, we have air getting in between us and the distance. I did that with my hands to show you how I'm trying to lead the viewer in with the directional strokes of this field to that point where the clouds are and radiate out like a V. So now this color may still look kind of dark in the distance. It's a dark magenta, but later you'll see me layer lighter values on top of this to really push those trees back into the distance. That's the beauty of soft pastel, just this ability to layer. Now I wanted my foreground to be darker, like some tall grasses, and you'll see by the end of this painting, I very much improvised this reference image. I made it my own. I used it more for inspiration rather than a strict guideline of what I was painting, and that's the fun part of art. Once you've been painting a while, is to break out your artistic license and do that. All right, so now we are going to add color more than just pinks and magentas, and in the beginning of this, on my Patreon portion, I described the color palette that I initially loved the photo because it had such a contrast between warm and cooler colors. It had cooler bluish turquoise colors in the sky, and it had pretty greenish, yellowy greenish colors in the landscape. And that's a very complementary color palette. So I'm now working with that main color palette. And again, if you haven't followed many of my tutorials and my underpainting instruction, an underpainting can really make such a statement to your final painting. Can you imagine if I was creating this just with the blues to begin with on the white paper, or it's actually kind of a cream colored paper with the Luxe Archival? These colors wouldn't be so exciting, and this underpainting really gives such an impact. And you can see I'm using the same principles of value. My distant field is further away, so I'm lightening up in value, and my strokes are becoming more horizontal. You're not going to see tall grasses in the distance. Things flatten out with horizontal bands, much like a blanket over a distant field. Now I'm going to create some what's called color echoing in this painting. I want my foreground and my sky to be harmonious, so I'm going to use some of the same colors in the sky that I'm using in the land. It actually happens in nature too. It's just not as obvious all the time. So I put that pretty light turquoise up in the sky. That middle section is more like where the sky is, not clouds. But before I get too crazy with that, I want to go ahead in and get in some of my other colors. This pretty golden color. It's funny, it's actually like an ochre, yellow ochre, but it almost turns into green as I add it to the distance. Pastels actually do interact with each other, and you can kind of mix colors that way like you can with wet mediums. Now this is a green, and I'm just again getting some of my color in. I find that it helps to work all over the whole painting rather than just getting too crazy in one area. Now this is a really dark green. I believe it's a Sennelier pastel, and I'm just layering a little bit over this tree and moving on. I'm going to lighten it up a little bit in a minute. And I'm using some of the same green to get that, this is kind of my lead-in to the painting, is that road and that tree. And I typically don't like a composition where you have a tree and a road that close to the edge of the paper, but I was liking, I don't know, something about pulling in from the side and almost pointing towards that that cloud explosion there was really intriguing to me. So I'm just getting some little marks on the road there, and I will add some more color to the road later. And now I'm just putting a little bit of highlights on this road. I wanted to brighten it up. I was imagining it like a gravel road, and later I come back in and add a little bit of a grassy color to those little middle sections. And now I've got an even lighter green. I believe this is maybe a Sennelier as well. It could be a unison pastel. And I'm just using this nice, pretty neutral warm green to get in some of these foreground grasses that are a little bit darker. Notice my strokes are still kind of directional. And if I haven't mentioned this already, it's Cloud Painting Month on my Patreon page. And if you're a beginner artist and some of this is a little intimidating, by the way, I'm just using my finger to blend here a little bit, but over on my Patreon page, I have lots of beginner content. I have some cloud painting tutorials that are more for the beginner. I have my lessons divided into little groupings with some specifically for beginners as well. But there's tons of content here on the Monet Cafe channel for free. My Patreon page is only $5 a month and you can cancel at any time. So there's lots of content for everyone at every level. And before focusing any more on the clouds, I'm going to get in some of my final, most yellowy greens, just cleaning my hands off a little bit there. And this is another pretty Terry Ludwig pastel. You can tell the Terry Ludwigs because they're square or kind of rectangular in their full shape. They're kind of square when I break them. All right, so I got my pretty foreground colors in. Now I'm doing the same thing that I did when I did the pink underpainting. I'm taking this darker turquoise blue, and I believe this may be a Jack Richardson pastel. I'm just moving it again on some of the underneath shadowy sides of these clouds. I did want to get a little bit in where that V's coming in, and I'm turning it in ways that I think will curve around those clouds and just give them some shape. And at this point, I am keeping my pressure very light. I want to keep this feeling just very impressionistic and alive, full of movement. So now I'm comparing a few colors, and this turquoise is kind of in between the first two that I just used, and I'm using it in two ways. I'm using it to have kind of a middle value transition, but it's also kind of blending and adding another layer on top of that darkest turquoise I put down. And it's just adding some color fun. It's really bringing a little bit more warmth to these clouds, which is great because the foreground land is warm as well. So now I'm using that same little color just to come in and get some little clouds that are in the distance. The sky behaves exactly like the landscape on a upside down scale. Things are perspectively getting smaller the further away they go, and so you just keep your strokes tighter and smaller and closer together and just little more linear marks. Now, sometimes I have to clean my pastels off. They get a little dirty. And now I have another beautiful color. This is a Sennelier pastel. I think it might be from the Paris collection set. And I'm using this to brighten up the sky part that's kind of in between the clouds. And just again, you see how I turn my pastel in ways that emulate how clouds perspectively behave. And often, I talk about this a lot in landscape paintings, often in the distant landscape just above the trees, often the sky is a little bit lighter right above the distant trees. So you'll see me develop that even more. Just to keep things echoing throughout, I added a little bit of that blue on the road. Now let's bring some light to these clouds. This pastel, I believe it's a Mount Vision. It looked a little rectangular at first, but I think it's got a flat side to it from working or applying it so much. And this is where these clouds are starting to take shape. I am just gently layering and turning my pastel in ways, like I keep saying, that I feel like these clouds would be turning. Remember, they're wispy, but they're three-dimensional objects. They behave that way when it comes to light and value and shadow. So this pastel, I'm kind of putting not only at the tops of some of the clouds, but I'm also lightening up areas of some of the sky where there's not any clouds showing. And I think now you can see how the original underpainting has influenced this painting. Can you imagine if I just used these same colors to create this painting without that underpainting? It would have looked not as exciting. And the pink serves to be a complement to the other blues and yellowy greens that I've used. And yes, there is still a lot of the spaces and the pink showing through, especially in the clouds and in the skies there. But I'm going to start using these pastels to start blending the clouds. And I've mentioned this quite a bit in other tutorials that pastels actually, once you apply a few layers, they will start blending themselves. So resist the urge to overblend in these initial stages because you're gonna see that happen very soon. So I'm still kind of filling in some of the spaces. I'm doing a little negative painting in this tree. It looked kind of like a blob before, and that's just other things that you learn the more you paint. Early on, I would have tried to paint all of the shapes of the tree, but I've learned in time that you can paint general shapes and carve into the tree, and it looks much more painterly when you paint negatively that way. I'm going to speed this up a bit more than I have over on my Patreon page, and I think sometimes that actually can be a good thing. You almost can see things come to life more so than you can when they're real time or a little bit slower. So I'm still getting in some of these pretty blues. I believe that blue was from the Earthberry set, that darker one I used. And I'm filling in kind of a lot of this space of the paper, the underpainting pink that's showing through, but not over layering. I still want to keep a light touch. And you can see in the clouds, they behave just like the land, or think of flowers on the foreground. Flowers in the foreground are going to be larger, and as they go into the distance, they get smaller, closer together, and more horizontal. Same thing happens with clouds, just on the reverse. Notice I have huge clouds in the front, and they gradually get smaller in the distance. Now here's where I'm showing you close up so you can see how much of this underpainting is still showing through. Now I like it at this stage. I sometimes just want to leave it as is, but I'm going to show you a trick that I do for blending that works so great. What I'm using is a harder pastel. It's a Rembrandt pastel, and it's kind of a middle gray, a light gray kind of, and I am using it to blend and soften the pastel layers I already have in the sky. Now, this wouldn't work if I just had one layer down, but when you start to get a few layers of pastels down, you can use other pastels to blend them together. And the best pastels to use are ones that are not super soft. The super soft ones just kind of layer on top, but the ones that are a little harder, like this Rembrandt, you can see better when I'm zoomed in here, they start to blend, much like a blending tool would. And I find this works better than using your finger. Your finger has oils in it. I use my fingers sometimes just to soften edges, but for something blending like this, this pastel is, first of all, not going to have that oily residue that your fingers would. And also, I find it doesn't muddy the colors as much as your fingers do. We want to keep our colors very fresh. But what I'm doing here is you'll see the clouds are starting to look a little more wispy, right? I'm using it specifically to soften some of the edges and also to blend some of the transitions of value. You know how I mentioned that underneath is darker, the top is lighter, and then in the middle it's a kind of a transition, and you can see that's really happening. It's starting to look like clouds, right? Now, I forgot to zoom out here, but I wanted to give some sunshine to these clouds. So this is a nice light buttery color of a Terry Ludwig pastel that I just glaze in a couple little spots that I feel like would accentuate the painting. Now, again, I didn't zoom out, but I used a Prismacolor new pastel. These are longer, skinnier, rectangular pastels, just to get in some suggestions of grasses in the foreground. When I zoom out, you'll be able to see where I worked. And also you'll see when I zoom out here, like magic, can you see how much more these clouds look like clouds? I've softened the edges with that little Rembrandt pastel. Now I'm adding a little bit more green to this tree. I feel like this painting really does feel like it has a sense of distance, and those clouds really do feel like they're coming from way far away and coming over your head. And I really liked the final result of this painting. I hope you did too. I hope you'll try it if you're a patron of mine. I love to see your results. That's one of the beautiful things about being in my Patreon families. I get to see your work, and it's a beautiful place to be. So enjoy, recreate, share, and as always, God bless and happy painting.